Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And then there's the rest of us. The ones who Shakespeare doesn't mention, who if we do stumble into greatness, it's usually because life has had to forcibly shove it up us, like the proverbial broom handle, to get us to stand up straight at all. Now, I've got 4 sons. Now, I realise that's not a world record, but it hasn't been a picnic either. In fact, recently one of my older ones said to me, as he was putting one of my checks into his inside pocket, he said, "Dad, just think, if you hadn't had us, what a simple life you'd now be leading." And I said, you know, if I hadn't, and if we hadn't had you, I would probably still be a travelling musician, slouched somewhere on a drab hotel bed on a wet Tuesday afternoon, wondering, where did it all go wrong? You see, most of us don't grow unless we're challenged. Like water through life, we tend to take the easiest, least obstructed path downhill, and yet we know there's no strength without resistance, there's no achievement without effort, and there's no family without responsibility. You see, you can father a child, that's easy. The hard part is then to become that child's father. And I think most of us men drift self-centeredly into parenthood, blind, bemused, and seemingly oblivious of the world around us. I mean, look at any typical wedding photograph. On the one side, you can have this radiant, resplendent, responsible-looking young lady, and next to her, this mildly immature male, sometimes amiable, sometimes awkward, sometimes arrogant, but always, when you look into his eyes, completely clueless. Next time you see him, he may have a baby in his arms with an expression even more bewildered, which seems to say, did I really order this? Because here's this young man who up to then has lived his life like a thermometer, casually measuring and reflecting the temperature of the world around him. Suddenly he now realizes he needs to become a thermostat, responsible for setting and regulating the temperature in his own home. You see, all responsibility is a choice, and like most choices, and unfortunately like some fathers, you can always walk away. Parenthood is a role that requires no aptitude test, no fit and proper persons test, and yet you're taking on a role of leadership. And suddenly, without warning, without any qualifications, overnight you have become a role model. And from that moment onwards, if you see your 8-year-old running around the house with his finger up the nose, it's because he's been watching you. The older ones with their feet on the sofa, they're just copying you. And if you hear them blaming all their problems on everybody around them, maybe they've just been listening to you. So how do you teach personal responsibility? Well, not by looking around you. Injury lawyers will tell you if you have an accident at work, first thing you do, blame your employer. Divorce lawyers will tell you if your marriage falls apart, blame it on your partner. And for years, psychologists have been telling us that if you feel all messed up inside, well, that's down to your parents. There's even an award for this sort of attitude, and it's called the Stella. The Stella, named after a lady who successfully sued McDonald's because she managed to pour hot coffee on herself. Product of a society which seems to urge us to do anything we can to blame all our problems on everybody else and not take any responsibility ourselves. Other winners of the Stella include a young man who sued his next-door neighbour for accidentally driving over his hands. Doesn't sound so unreasonable until you realise he was stealing his hubcaps at the time. Or the lady who successfully sued a furniture store because she said they'd allowed an unruly child to rampage through the place, causing her to have an accident. And yes, you've got it, it was her own child. Now, when I was young, I remember being told that whenever you point a finger of accusation at somebody, you'll always have your other 3 fingers pointing back at you. It took a long time for me to work that one out, because I just carried on pointing my finger of accusation happily, but I just did it with a nice relaxed hand so that my other 3 fingers We're pointing to my wife. So you can see, a sense of responsibility takes a long time to come to some of us. Some of you thinking of your partners thinking, if it ever comes at all. But all responsibility, it's about balance. Most truths in life are about balance. And some of us, well, maybe will take too much responsibility. Parents take too much responsibility for their children. Micromanaging them, controlling them, overprotecting them. I think it was Khalil Gibran who famously said, as parents, we are merely the bows from which our children as living arrows are sent forth. And yet, most of us will take so much responsibility for our child that we'll end up with two lives, and then they'll end up without any. But responsibility will come to each of us. It comes in different forms. It may come looking after children. It may come through responsibilities at work. It may come simply as a child learning to look after a household pet. But whatever that responsibility is, we should learn to recognize it, embrace it, and when the time is right, be able to let it go. Now, the world outside may not notice any great difference, but in the quietness of our own hearts, I'm sure we'll realize that by facing up to our responsibilities, we take one or two small steps towards our own form of personal or private greatness. Because I believe you cannot become responsible without, in some small way, becoming great. So the choice, ladies and gentlemen, is simple. It's carrying on with that one finger pointing out, or it's accepting those three fingers pointing back. That's your choice because that's your responsibility. And yet I also believe that each one of us at some stage will come to a moment in our lives when we can stop, look back and reflect, and I'm sure we'll realize none of us are born responsible. Some of us achieve responsibility, but in the end, most of us have had responsibility thrust upon us.